For Dartmouth East, and I'll remind all members, if you've got something to say, stand up before the motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned the other day, experience is the ultimate educator. So I thank the honourable members for this House as we continue to learn the unfolding process here in the House of Assembly. So, Mr. Speaker, I rise this evening to speak on supply of the budget estimates. And as all members of this House do, I have no doubt, they start to go through the budget, Mr. Speaker, they start to analyze, look at the numbers, look at the strategic objectives laid out by a government. And just as I used to teach my students in the classroom, Mr. Speaker, to analyze documents, oftentimes you're always looking for what's not there, what's lacking, what's missing, in any document, in any strategic plan, which a budget certainly lays out for a fiscal year. And Mr. Speaker, as members of this caucus have pointed out, certainly we've indicated to the government we don't see the long-term investments in mental health that we've been advocating for many years. And we've discussed that in the media. We've discussed that in our messaging with Nova Scotians. Along with that, Mr. Speaker, we've also indicated we don't see a long-term strategy for jobs or an economic strategy for long-term prosperity for Nova Scotians. It's also been pointed out by other members of this House that we don't see an emphasis on long-term care. We don't see a single nursing home, new nursing home beds for our seniors. And while going through the budget, along with all this, while going through the budget, going through the estimates, in particular with education, I noticed something that was lacking, something that I believe, Mr. Speaker, should be emphasized. And I think if we stop and think and reflect, as I'm about to mention this, I think we should be seriously considering what's lacking, specifically with the education estimates. Now, last week, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance of our province on March 22nd, during question period, indicated that there would be an education component for employees of the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission as it relates to the implementation of cannabis. And there would also be an education program for all Nova Scotians to get information out there as to the dangers of cannabis use. And that got me thinking, Mr. Speaker, why is it we don't see in this budget an education component in our schools? And let me ask that question again. Is the Nova Scotia education system prepared for the legalization of cannabis? And if one looks at the budget estimates, one concludes that there is something clearly lacking there. And according to the estimates, there doesn't appear to be any money allocated for cannabis education in our schools. So, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I believe money does need to be allocated for cannabis education. It's missing. It needs to be included. Why was it excluded? We know, Mr. Speaker, that the approach the federal government is taking with the legalization of cannabis has more to do with breaking the black market than it does in promoting, I believe, the long-term health of Canadians and, by extension, of course, Nova Scotians. And we see that, Mr. Speaker, if the federal government, if this provincial government had been serious about health, they would have adhered to the recommendations of the Canadian Medical Association and the Psychology Association. So, Mr. Speaker, I know we are agreed in this House that if this is happening, we need to ensure education for the workers at NSLC. We need to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that all Nova Scotians, through an advertising campaign, need to get information out there. Why not in our schools? Why not in our schools? And that, of course, Mr. Speaker, is something I encourage. That is something I ask this government to focus on because it is fundamental. The dangers of cannabis As a former teacher, as this House knows, I've seen firsthand, I have no doubt many people in this House have seen firsthand the dangers of that. And there is nothing more tragic, Mr. Speaker, than seeing a young person who has caused harm to themselves, cognitive harm, as a result of chronic use of cannabis. So, of course, if one does a jurisdictional scan, Mr. Speaker, taking a look at jurisdictions that have legalized cannabis and taking a look at their education systems and looking at their experience, I think we can learn a lot. If we take the case of Colorado, Mr. Speaker, which legalized cannabis in 2014, we saw a huge increase in the usage of cannabis in students, and from their experience, we know legalization will remove the stigma of cannabis use. So we have to make sure, Mr. Speaker, if that stigma is now being fully removed within our society, which inevitably, Mr. Speaker, will happen with the legalization of cannabis, we must ensure solid education programming within our public school system, along, Mr. Speaker, with the necessary supports to make sure they're in place for our students. So again, why hasn't money been allocated in the budget for what I believe needs to be a priority, Mr. Speaker, if we are, as a society, as a nation, moving in this direction that the federal government is pushing the provinces to move towards? Like anything else, Mr. Speaker, our systems need to adapt accordingly. So, if one does some research on the case of Colorado, you read, of course, some of the literature that educators have put out there. They will indicate to you that it is more challenging to educate about the harmful effects of cannabis on the developing brain in the context, Mr. Speaker, where the stigma has been removed. So therefore, as a few people in this House know, as former teachers, the programming is going to need to adapt. The approach, the pedagogy, the approach may have to change because the social situation in which we will find ourselves after July will be different. So again, Mr. Speaker, I hope eventually that the estimates will reflect that our programming needs to adapt along with the necessary supports, along with the necessary investments. Mr. Speaker, we know from research from the Canadian Medical Association, the literature that they've put out over the past few months, the past few years, we know that the human brain is not fully developed until the age of 25. And we know specifically for our youth, we want to create an environment where they can develop, they can socialize in the healthiest environment possible. And I have no doubt that all members of the House want that type of environment for our young people, for our students. I know, Mr. Speaker, professionally, as a former educator, working as an acting vice principal, many of the discipline issues, many of the behavior issues, some of the learning issues that I encountered as an acting vice principal, some of those cases could be traced back to chronic use of cannabis, and how sometimes a young person's life spirals out of control as a result of that. What supports will be in place? What new policies will we give our educators to help prepare this new world, I guess, that's coming at us after July? We know, Mr. Speaker, from the Canadian Medical Association that we see cardiovascular and pulmonary effects as a result of chronic cannabis use. I believe, Mr. Speaker, we need to ensure that we have that information out to our students, that it needs to be embedded into the curriculum and money ready to be deployed to schools to ensure that we get adequate programming, adequate information, the proper information to our students. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that the Canadian Medical Association has indicated, many in this House are aware, is we see an increased risk of mental illness, mental health issues, And we know, Mr. Speaker, often for some, cannabis can be a trigger for some into a psychosis. It can be a trigger into a mental state that is very problematic for their development. And Mr. Speaker, just these three things, for example, these are things that could be stressed. These are things that could be openly talked about and discussed in the classroom. So, Mr. Speaker, will we see an increase in drug-related suspensions in our public schools as a result of the legalization of cannabis? Time will tell. Let's be upfront and let's be clear. And many know this with their kids going through the school system. It's everywhere. It's everywhere in our public system by the time you get to junior high and high school. So these are some key questions. Are we going to see an increase in drug-related suspensions? What will be the dynamic after July as a result of this? And of course, if there is an increase in usage, Mr. Speaker, I challenge this government. What policies will we put in place to ensure a cannabis-free school? How will policies on cannabis be enforced by our teachers and our administrators, Mr. Speaker? So these are some perennial questions. These are some key questions, Mr. Speaker, that I think all members of this House, I hope, will reflect upon. Certainly, I hope the government begins a process of planning and keeping this in consideration. Fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, I'm challenging the House. Is our education system prepared for the legalization of cannabis? And if one examines the estimates in this budget, specifically on education, one concludes, no, we are not. Mr. Speaker, I encourage this government to get to work and fix that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.